Now, I know that some of you choose to call us superheroes.
We're X-Men, that's what we do.
These videos are not for children. If you are a children, then piss off.
Hey there, I'm the Infuso. And let me just say it now, let me just put it all out on the table so we can move past it right now. But I truly think the Fox-Men movie franchise gets way too much shit. And I mean, yeah, sure, granted, I am here to contribute to that pile, but it's still a problem nonetheless. I'm just not doing anything in terms of the solution. I'm just addressing that there is, in fact, an issue here. Listen, I know it has its problems, I know it's not perfect, but you have to remember that this was a movie franchise that was started all the way back in the year 2000. Not only were cinematic universes not really an established thing, you know, outside of Kevin Smith's films, but superhero movies in general were seen as childish and were thought to be somewhat outdated. Plus, I'm pretty sure at the time, like, what was the limit? Was it like 3 or 4? Like, if you make a superhero franchise, you can only get to what, like 3 or 4 at the time? And that means you did something right? Anyway, for one reason or another, superhero movies weren't looked upon fondly at the time. Might have something to do with the movie Batman and Robin. Thanks for that, Joel. And may you rest in peace, you sweet, sweet man. It kind of seemed like the X-Men movies to a degree knew this, because while they still did try to appeal to children, much like the movie's director, but they also tried to appeal to a more grown-up audience. And they treated their source material with far more respect than other superhero movies that were out at the time did. And hey, listen, I love the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, but they're intentional camptastic zaniness. Like, these are still good Spider-Man movies, but, you know, they're also very evidently Sam Raimi movies. But the X-Men franchise, to a degree, tried to take itself seriously, and I applaud it for that. And you know what? Not even only that. But despite the passing of time and the evolution of the superhero movie genre, the franchise still stuck around, and continued to evolve into the new superhero movie style. Which, I guess, is fitting for movies about evolved human beings. This whole thing predates the MCU. That means when creating this, they didn't have the foresight that the MCU did, but by God did they still go out of their way to continually try to add on or piece things together. And speaking of continuity, I think that's the best place to start. For all the reasons I just previously listed, the X-Men franchise's continuity is just all over the place. Which is a little irritating to me because if you know me, then you know I'm a continuity hound. So, you know, I thought here was the proper place to bring up just, you know, 1 or 2 or 300 problems that I have with it. Mind you, this isn't all the problems I have with the series. These are just the ones that are coming to the top of my head now. First and foremost, the X-Men don't age. Like, none of them. Like, not even one. You have the prequel movies, which show you younger versions of characters like Magneto and Professor X. But within those movies, like within those prequel movies, each one of those movies comes out a decade after the other. So when you're watching like 5 X-Men movies with the same cast back to back to back, just understand that you're watching 5 decades worth of adventures of these people together. And yet, everybody looks the same. Now, yeah, I know. Some of you may be thinking, well, yeah, they're X-Men. Maybe their genes are so mutated it either slows down or completely nullifies the aging process. Did you ever think of that? And I did think of that, but I don't spend too much time thinking about that kind of stuff because I don't think it helps to think about things you're wrong about. Because all the way back in the first X-Men movie, they make a big deal about Wolverine's genes somehow keeping him young forever. Yes, I believe that's what they call Hugh Jackman syndrome. Then again, in First Class, they seem to retcon Mystique looking relatively young in the first X-Men movies by saying that around the time she was in her 50s or 60s, she would have the appearance of a woman in her 30s. Thus explaining why she was played by a younger actress in the future timeline. Which, perfect, yeah, that makes sense to me. But why are we explaining these things away when every other mutant seems incapable of aging past the age of 30? This whole thing just leaves me asking a million questions, like, at what point in time will James McAvoy turn into Patrick Stewart? This isn't even something I could say affects the mutant characters specifically, because even the few human characters who are introduced into this universe, They don't age a day in the course of decades. And look, man, I don't know what they're doing, but somebody hook me up and put me on their regimen, because I'm just straight up not looking good right now. In X-Men Origins, Sabretooth is revealed as Wolverine's half-brother. They've had a bond before they ultimately became enemies. In Origins, the character is shown to be intelligent, and cunning, and manipulative. But in the first X-Men movie, which is supposed to take place long after, he doesn't even seem to recognize his own flesh and blood. And the movie's approach to the character seems to be to make him more animal than man. So how do you explain that? What did this guy's mutation de-evolve him over time? Then there's the whole Xavier walking thing. So canonically, it's shown that Professor X loses his mobility at the end of First Class. But when we're shown him later on in X-Men Origins, he's A, clearly older, and B, clearly able to still walk. But then when we get back to Days of Future Past later on, they try to retcon this by stating that he takes a serum that allows him to walk, but it blocks out all his other mutant abilities. Except back in that X-Men Origins scene, he's using his abilities while walking and while being Patrick Stewart. So, yeah, there's that. Also, another thing about that serum is that it was actually developed by Beast and not Professor X himself. And Beast created this formula hoping to cure himself of his blue gene, which, I guess technically he did. But when Beast is introduced in The Last Stand originally, we see the character transfixed at the sight of his natural skin color. So what's up with that? How can you be amazed with a mutant cure when you already invented it several years ago? How does that work? Emma Frost is shown to be a heroic mutant in Origins. If you didn't see her, I don't blame you, it's a blink and you miss moment. You probably weren't missing a whole lot either way. But then later, we're introduced to Emma in First Class, and she's clearly a completely different woman. And she's far from the only one. Moira McTaggart shows up as a Scottish doctor working alongside the X-Men in The Last Stand, only for her to show back up in the prequel movie series as an American CIA agent. Caliban shows up in Apocalypse as an underground kingpin of sorts, whereas when he reappears in Logan, all he is Professor X's pigment-deprived caretaker. Psylocke joins Magneto in The Last Stand, but a completely different Psylocke joined the Horsemen of Apocalypse. The Sentinels have been created on 2 different occasions, both times by guys named Bolivar Trask. They were made in 2 completely different time periods, made entirely differently, but there you go. And don't you even get me started on Deadpool. I don't even want to take this conversation there, because I could write a thesis. Wolverine's claws and overall bone structure go from being filled with adamantium, to having the adamantium taken out of him, to randomly being filled up with adamantium again. I don't know, maybe Magneto did something in between the movies. Fuck you, who cares? And speaking of Magneto, Magneto is forcibly given a serum which takes away his powers, only for them to return to him again. Somehow. Professor X is obliterated in The Last Stand, but it's revealed in an end-of-the-credits scene that he uses the body of a comatose patient to return. You know, except the morality behind that is highly questionable. And we never really see this patient, because when Professor X does return, he's shown to be in his own body. I mean, sure, yeah, I guess you could say, hey, maybe it was his twin, you know, maybe the guy's got a look-alike. It would be stupid to say that, but yeah, you could say that, like the people in charge of the movies have said, that is categorically their answer to this. Professor X secretly had a twin who was left in a vegetative state that he kept lying around so one day he could use them for organs. I don't see anything wrong with that if you don't. But okay, so let's just say we go with that, right? Let's say that he had access to him at all times. But when Professor X comes back, he's still in a wheelchair. Can his twin also not use their legs? Because if so, then, I mean, that's just one hell of a coincidence, and just an overall bummer for everyone. In X-Men Origins, Wolverine is shot in the head twice with adamantium bullets. While this doesn't kill him, it does give him amnesia. But in Logan, his evil counterpart, who once again is based on himself, is just straight up killed using adamantium bullets. Why is that? Also, Wolverine's memory comes and goes as it pleases. For the majority of the series, he has amnesia. But we're later shown that he remembers everything in the Wolverine, only for him to go back to being oblivious to everything else in a future movie. Like, I don't understand. Is he supposed to remember more the more movies come out? When you guys released X-Men Origins, timeline-wise, now he remembers X-Men Origins? Is that the way it goes? Because I gotta be honest, I don't think your movies are helping anybody out. Because I don't know what's going on in your movies. This guy definitely doesn't know what the fuck's going on in your movies. At the end of Days of Future Past Logan's body is found in the ocean by Stryker's forces. But it's revealed that this isn't actually Stryker, but Mystique in disguise. So then why is it when we see Logan in Apocalypse, he's being experimented on by the real Stryker? Actually, you know what? Come to think of it, and this is something I gotta bring up now. Why did we need this many versions of this character? Is it just me? I mean, don't get me wrong, I actually really do like Stryker. I understand that this version of the character is like worlds away from his comic book counterpart, but man, Brian Cox's performance in X2, I gotta tell you, man, completely changed how I look at this character altogether. But these movies have this really weird over-reliance on him for Wolverine's arc. I get that that's mainly because X2 kind of hyped him up and alerted everyone to the fact that he has a past Wolverine. And I get that if you aren't an avid comic book reader and you just go in and you watch the movies, you probably think this guy's like super important, and he's not. Well, like at all. He's just not. And I think what's especially strange is that not only do none of the actors who play this character act anything like the character from the comic, but none of them act anything like each other. And I don't understand how I'm supposed to believe all three of these people are one person at three different points in time. We see Stryker portrayed brilliantly in X2 by Brian Cox. But then when we see him again in X-Men Origins, he's portrayed still, quite well, but entirely different. Also, this guy's kind of up there in age still, so how old is Stryker supposed to be? I remember originally Brian Cox was said to come back for this, and they were going to use computer aging technology to try to digitally de-age him and make him look a little bit younger. And now I'm watching this guy, and I'm like, this guy is like what? Like fucking... I refuse to believe that he's like more than 10 years younger than fucking Brian Cox. And you're like, oh, this guy's the right age. And it's funny because I don't even dislike this guy. I don't think he's bad at all. It's just, hashtag not my Stryker. And then we see Stryker again in Days of Future Past. And in the past portion of events, I think it's supposed to take place after Origins, but Stryker's now being played by this young dude, who honestly is just oatmeal. Not a very bad performance, just a very blah one. So I'll ask again, why are there so many Strykers? He's so inconsequential to the overall X-Men story and the stories of some of these movies some of the time. I don't understand why these movies feel they need to go out of the way to either reference this character or to incorporate him into their stories. It's a very, very strange decision. Ironically enough, I thought the closest performance anyone in the entire series ever came to somewhat duplicating the original Stryker was the villain from Logan, Donald Pierce. Now that should have been Stryker. As stated before, in these movies, Stryker is such a big deal that he needs not one, not two, but three different actors to play his part. Whereas in the comics, he's mostly a third-rate, inconsequential villain. He's a holier-than-thou Bible thumper who believes mutants are actually demons, and that they've been sent from the devil. Though much like his movie counterpart, that somehow doesn't stop him from keeping their company. Go figure. But outside of that, there are so few similarities between the comic book character and the live-action adaptation that realistically, it doesn't even warrant a compare and contrast list. By the way, I did enjoy the little nod to the source with the emblem being cross-oriented in X-Men Origins. Caught that, like it. Juggernaut is almost nothing like his source material. In the movies, he's depicted as being a mutant, which he isn't. His powers are actually, believe it or not, magic-oriented. And they're powered by a gem in the helmet he wears. Also, some of you may be surprised to know this, but in the comics, he's actually Professor X's stepbrother. And I just don't even have the will to talk in detail about what they did to my boy Gambit. These certainly aren't the only cases in this franchise, but they're the most outrageous that come to mind when thinking about it. Mutant power levels are something that's introduced in The Last Stand, and then it's talked about throughout the rest of the movie as if it's always been a thing. This is a level 7 mutant. This is a level 4 mutant. And I get that in certain X-Men comics, mutant power levels are in fact a thing. But they've never been established in this universe. And not only that, just all of a sudden everybody is aware of them and knows other people's power levels. Like, I shit you not, Xavier never once opens his fucking bald, Mr. Humpty Dumpty looking head and says anything about a fucking mutant power level. And then you turn on The Last Stand and no one wants to shut the fuck up about them. Like, apparently they're a big deal. And then any one of the X-Men movies you put on after The Last Stand never mentions them again. Completely forgotten. In the first movie, Professor X claims that he and Magneto built Cerebro. But then it's actually showed in the flashback movie years later that Beast created Cerebro while he was working for the CIA. So now, not only is Charles just a guy who embellishes the truth, Charles is a guy who just makes shit up. You can't take that dude anywhere. You go anywhere with him, he just looks around and says, oh, you see this over here?
I made that.
Why, in the first X-Men movie, I seem to recall Charles telling me that he met Eric when he was 17. But then we're later shown them meeting for the first time, and I'm pretty sure that they're closer to in their 30s. The professor also claims that Cyclops, Storm, and Jean Grey were some of his first students. And they were not. Or second, or third. They were about at least 2 or 3 generations of students into his career. So, you know, then again, I can't blame the professor too much. He's an older man. Maybe his brain is, maybe it's starting to go. He's getting up there in age, getting down there in years left to live. Magneto also says that he designed his helmet himself in an attempt to keep himself protected from Cerebro. But in First Class, we actually see that he stole the helmet off that douchebag from Footloose. Havoc and Cyclops are depicted as being brothers, despite being decades apart. I mean, I guess it's not impossible, but it's definitely, you know, improbable. I think by the time these movies came out, you may as well just had Havoc be his father. Because, like, age-wise, it just seems to make a lot more sense. But then again, maybe I'm asking for a little bit too much logic in a series which made one character a teenager in the 60s, and then again in the 80s. Both Nightcrawler's parents, Mystique and Azazel, appear in the series, as does Nightcrawler himself, twice. But there's no reference to them parenting everyone's favorite teleporter. There's not even a hint of romance or anything between the two. They absolutely never interact. I mean, Mystique and Nightcrawler interact a couple times, but again, at no point is it ever officially revealed that he's her son. Likewise, Magneto appears on screen with his son Quicksilver, and plenty of references were made to the fact that the big bad Magnet Man was his daddy. But you know, no one actually ever told Magneto about any of this.
What? You're my dad?
Yes.
Can we talk about this?
No, we will never speak of it again.
Outside of their performances, the characters look wildly inconsistent from movie to movie. Mystique looked the same for the original trilogy. But then in First Class, when Jennifer Lawrence plays her, she looks like this. Which, granted, looks more like someone's Comic-Con cosplay, but it is in fact at least an attempt to duplicate the first look. They got the first Mystique look right for Days of Future Past. Seriously, now she just looks like a younger version of her original counterpart. But then they completely ruin it in Dark Phoenix. Like, look at that. What is that? Come on. Beast looks pretty much exactly how you'd expect him to look, or at least how I expected him to look. Seriously, look at that. That's perfection. But then in the prequels, when he first succumbs to his blue infliction, he turns into a furry. Because of course he does. Thankfully for all of us, and I guess, you know, for himself as well, his look was saved in the following movie and for the remainder of the series when he came out looking like this. And before I move to my next subject, here's a quick speed round. Magneto's gone through several helmet prototypes over the years. Professor X has lost his hair on at least 2 occasions for 2 separate reasons. Xavier and Raven are in several scenes together throughout the original trilogy, and they have little to no interaction with each other. But then it's later retconned that they had a close friendship and almost a sibling-like bond. I don't know what feels more odd, the fact that they added this to the continuity after the fact, knowing that these two don't have any real dynamic during these movies, or just hearing Charles casually bring this up in Days of Future Past, and having no one question him on it whatsoever. I just find it funny how nobody there's thinking, whoa, Professor, why didn't you tell us this like 30 to 40 years ago? Like I said before, this isn't even the half of it. This is just a little bit. Many more arguments could be made. The timeline is very flawed, and trying to go into these movies with anything but individual adventure experience and like hoping to find some kind of like broader string of continuity, you're going to be sorely disappointed. Now, granted, movies like Days of Future Past did heavily play up upon and try to fix the X-Men movie canon, but there were just too many holes to fill, and that X-ship sunk in its own error. There's also a lot more completely misrepresented or underutilized characters. Mystique was turned straight babyface when she was played by megastar Jennifer Lawrence, probably in an attempt by the studio to try to capitalize off her fame. But Mystique in the comics, while not necessarily a quote-unquote bad person, was still very clearly a bad guy. To be honest, I found Rebecca Romijn to be a lot more close to the source material than her follow-up. Actually, come to think of it, I think my only major gripe with the original trilogy's use of the character is that she's primarily just used as a henchman, whereas the character worked as the mastermind of her own evil plots in the comics. But the Mystique face turn in the prequel movies seemed greatly misguided, and all of this overexposure to her character kinda made her, well, ironically enough, kinda made her lose her mystique. Plus, Jennifer Lawrence never seemed like she actually wanted to be on set. Her performance got worse with each passing movie, and she kind of came across like a passionless, whiny brat. And we don't need those in our movies, alright? Stay home and make a YouTube channel like every other talentless loser on this platform. Angel gets two different actors to portray his character, and both are bland and boring and borderline forgettable. Even affording them this sentence seems entirely unnecessary. Like, I'm putting more thought into this sentence than the writers put thought to their place in their creative universe. Deadpool's depiction in Origins may be the most sacrilegious. Wade Wilson is played expertly by Ryan Reynolds, who does a really good job for what he's given. He's every bit the sarcastic, over-the-top douchebag you'd expect him to be. But then later on, he basically becomes a live-action Baraka. Why? Y'all turned the merc with the mouth to the merc without a mouth. Like, what would make you think that that was a smart idea? This literally goes against everything people love about the character. Who allows you to make these decisions, and why is nobody questioning theirs? Don't even get me started with Rogue. Rogue is portrayed as the new kid on the team, an innocent, oblivious little girl who has a power that frightens her. And that's just not Rogue. What I never understood is that there is in fact a character who kind of perfectly fits this narrative. And her name is Jubilee. Why did you take the kick-ass Southern Belle and turn her into a complete pansy? Rogue could more than hold her own. This depiction annoyed me from the get-go. I loved the first X-Men movie, but even as a kid, I found this highly questionable. Storm, who is an African queen, is played by Halle Berry, who can't, for the life of her, do an African accent, thus proving that Hollywood doesn't know the difference between an African actor and a black actor. Though I guess anyone would know that, seeing that dude from Get Out's performance in Black Panther. So everybody posting and sharing hashtags that you want Beyonce to play Storm.
How about no?
Iceman is dating Rogue in the movies, but he's depicted as being gay in the comics. And I kind of always thought that the movies were going to set this up to one day out Bobby. But considering that he had to come out of the mutant closet on screen, I guess there's really no reason to rehash that. But I think what bothered me the most about Bobby and Rogue being together is that it kind of closed the door on the show's interpretation of the relationship of Rogue and Gambit, which is easily top 3 comic book romances of all time. And anybody looking to comment Joker and Harley in the comment section, well, you're wrong, and you know what, I just don't want you here anymore, I want you to leave. Cyclops was actually properly cast, but nothing was really ever done with him in these movies. It's weird, they got the right guy for the right part, but he doesn't do anything in it. His relationship with Jean took center stage, and we really never saw him as the leader that he's supposed to be. Again, this is weird because I truly feel that this guy was perfect as Cyclops, but You know, what was he doing as Cyclops? He was perfect for the job that he was given, but there was no work for him when he showed up. Juggernaut was a juggernaut. They basically just made the dude a meme. I don't even feel like going any further into that conversation. I just play this one clip, and that's all you need to know. Well, what else can I say after that?
Don't you know who I am? I'm the Juggernaut, bitch!
That was something that was put into a movie. Characters like Warpath, Gambit, Spike, Darwin, Toad, Blob, Pyro, and Multiple Man are all greatly underutilized, serving the story mostly as background characters or just unimportant throwaway names. And being the X-Men dork that I am, that is kind of upsetting. Professor X, who I loved in these movies, is turned into a secret antagonist twice in the films. The first time in The Last Stand, it's somewhat understandable. He had to tamper with Jean's mind in order to protect her and everyone else from her. His intentions were good, but it's not hard to see how he could be seen as a villain in this scenario. Here he is, without consent, going through people's memories, going through people's minds. And even if he is doing it for the right thing, you can imagine some people still being really, really pissed off at that. But then when they tried to recreate that story with Dark Phoenix years later, instead of using that narrative with him, they were like, what if we just make him a dick? Well, yeah, we'll just make him a dick, like just a dick. Dark Phoenix completely rewrites him as a prideful moron who cares more about being in the public eye than the welfare of his young students who work alongside him. And that is so not Professor X. The safety of Professor X's students are always, or should always, come first. And that's why, even though I wasn't a huge fan of what they did with him in The Last Stand, it was an understandable thing to do. It was still a Professor X thing to do. He didn't want to have to tamper with Jean's mind, but he knew that if he didn't, he was putting people at risk. Here, he's just too busy shaking people's hands and getting his picture taken to acknowledge that his team may have a serious problem. The one who's properly defending the class and mutant kind in this movie is Mystique, who is supposed to be an actual villain, but also now in this continuity she's trying to act heroic. In this movie, Mystique throws everything she can at Charles. She mentions how the women on the team are defending the men more than vice versa, which I don't know if that's even true with the way the movie sets this up. Like, it's just, that's never really been the case. I kind of think everyone just had everyone's back. And on top of that, it's like, Mystique, the last major team-up movie, you were the main problem. Like, everyone had to stop you, so maybe get off your high horse, you fucking Smurf-looking bitch. Not for nothing, though. Like, technically speaking, in that continuity of things, in Days of Future Past, Mystique kind of created a situation in which mutants were being targeted because they were mutant. Because she went after Bolivar Trask. They had to go back in time, fix that, and hope that the Sentinel situation died down in the future. Which, thankfully, I guess it did. My point is that she's like the last person who should come out here talking about all the good that she's done. The world has specifically had to be saved from you and your actions on multiple occasions in the past. Actually, come to think of it, even the characters who were well represented and were expertly portrayed, they were still a little off the mark. Case in point, Wolverine. You see, the thing about Wolverine, he's a grisly animal of a man who doesn't necessarily value hygiene or morality. And he's also significantly shorter than his live-action counterpart. Actually, the Wolverine from the comics is a full foot shorter than his real-life interpretation. He goes through life hunched over at a very unintimidating 5'3". He's also a lot more violent in the comics. And I probably wouldn't classify him as leadership material. I mean, don't get me wrong, he definitely was a big deal. And he was probably one of the most marketable X-Men ever. But he was never the face of the team. Like, he was never the X-Man. Nightcrawler was brilliantly played to perfection by one Alan Cumming. The character is shown to be a pacifist who despises confrontation. Nightcrawler, despite his devilish appearance in the comics, did in fact have a heart of gold. But he wasn't against laying the smacketh down when it came to it. I mean, if he did, then why would he ever be on the X-Men? He believed in what was right, but he was always down to fight the good fight. The man was not only an expert in hand-to-hand combat, but he could sword fight as well. But in these movies, they kind of they emphasize his religion, and because he's a demon of God, then he cannot fight fist to fist. Which I can imagine is a lot of help when you're making a superhero flick that involves a lot of punch-kicking. Another big issue I have with this franchise is just how forced certain elements of it seem. There's just a couple things here and there where I just gotta think to myself, like, really though? I mean, don't get me wrong, we're talking about a fictitious world filled with superpowered humans. But even with that context, even in that universe, some of the creative decisions are still kinda head-scratching. Introducing Magneto's new family only moments later to kill them off, to set up a reason for Magneto to be Magneto again, after the movie only just established that Magneto settled down to start a family following Days of Future Past, so he's not Magneto anymore. Well, it just sounds needlessly complicated, and incredibly cheap, and totally unnecessary. And that's because it was. Havoc, after having been established as a main character since First Class, showing up for a cameo in Days of Future Past, returns for Apocalypse to introduce his little brother, who must be like 20 years younger than him at least. Going by this timeline, the Summers boys share all of 2 scenes together, and while a bond is implied, it's not really established. That same movie, Havoc is shockingly killed off, leaving Scott allegedly heartbroken. But it's hard to feel for them, because we don't really know what the dynamic between them was. Scott being Havoc's little brother feels so disjointed from the rest of the series. Saying that this was underdeveloped feels like an understatement. The main line of movies seems to have this very odd pattern. It's like, make 2 good movies and follow it up with 2 bad ones. X-Men 1, good movie. X-Men 2, great movie. But The Last Stand, not so good. Bad movie. Followed it up, they made Origins, terrible movie. Came back with First Class, good movie. Days of Future Past, great movie. Apocalypse, bland movie. Dark Phoenix, worst. The worst movie. This up and down of the franchise over the years led to an X-Men fatigue from audiences and led to a lot of criticisms of, well, just about everything. And before anybody asks, yes, for this I am only using the movies with X-Men in the title. We're talking about the main continuity of movies. Outside of that, their side projects are usually pretty good. I mean, I can't say that I'm the biggest fan of the movie The Wolverine, but I do at least appreciate it. I mean, it's not bad. I just don't know if it lived up to the whole, giving Wolverine another standalone movie type. The Deadpool movies are pretty fantastic, and I think they really managed to balance the character out properly. Between allowing him to be a masked goofball breaking the fourth wall at the expense of the plot, to allowing him to be more than just a punchline. Surprisingly, a lot of the times in the Deadpool movies, he can feel like a real person. An extremely sarcastic pain in the ass, but a person nonetheless. Ryan Reynolds seems to have a really good grasp on this character. And the cast and crew he worked with on both of these films seem to complement each other very, very well. Logan was a great, gritty movie that, while implied to be tied into the rest of the continuity, it also establishes itself as its own separate thing. This isn't like any other X-Men movie, so maybe it's appropriate that it doesn't share the X-Men title. It is, however, a grim take on the dark reality our heroes from the previous movies may face, and Hugh Jackman especially gives a hell of a performance. The supporting cast is equally fantastic, and the story being told here is so different from anything that's ever come before it. The Last Stand was the first movie made on someone else's accord. It had its good moments. Kelsey Grammer was perfectly cast as Beast, and I will forever regret that this didn't happen in a better movie. He's literally one of the only reasons I have to go back and watch this, and that is not an exaggeration. In all seriousness, probably the only reason I ever go back and rewatch this. It featured the deaths of prominent characters of the last 2 movies, including the likes of Cyclops and Professor X, and you'd think with all the time we've spent with them, that their losses would be taking a toll. But no, the movie just kind of moves past it. Rogue becomes a whiny, snot-faced brat filled with angst. Iceman starts seeing Shadowcat while he's already dating Rogue. Angel shows up and takes his shirt off so everybody can see his wings and his pecs, and he's got his own little subplot away from everything else going on in the movie. I don't know. It's just not any good. But to the movie's credit, it is the first time someone else took the helm. And I personally think it has a lot of interesting ideas when written down on paper. Unfortunately, it's the execution of those ideas that, could be better. Origins was the first movie to be made outside of the original trilogy. It was made for the purpose of kickstarting a brand new prequel trilogy showing the origins of characters such as Wolverine, Magneto, and Nightcrawler, and I think Cyclops, from what I can remember. Don't quote me. But the movie was so bad, it ended the X-Men Origins series before it ever officially began. The movie began the litany of continuity errors that this series would become infamous for. It introduced us to a bunch of characters no one particularly cared for, and then we got lesser versions of characters we did care for, like young Cyclops and slightly less old Stryker. If there's anything that this movie could be applauded for, if there's anything, any kind of pat on the back that I can give this movie that it did right or it did better than any of the other X-Men movies, I would say that this is by far the superior Sabretooth. And the fact that he never returned to another one of these movies after the first one, probably the worst thing about that. Apocalypse was boring. I understand that that sounds like the least I can say about it, but it actually also might be the most I can say about it. Because I've watched this movie 3 times, and I still couldn't tell you what happens. Oscar Isaac is terribly miscast as Apocalypse, looking and sounding nowhere near as threatening or important, just plays your typical villain with a savior complex. Magneto was given a family just to casually kill them off. Also, it could serve the purpose of just bringing Michael Fassbender back into this movie franchise. Just let the guy move on. He did a good job. He could have continued on with his life and career. The movie also reintroduces its audiences to characters such as Nightcrawler and Storm. And they're not necessarily bad, but they don't really get the chance to make an impression. Angel, again, as stated before, is a completely pointless bore, though still somehow an upgrade from his Last Stand counterpart. And then there's Dark Phoenix. Now, Dark Phoenix took the problems of Apocalypse and just straight up amplified them. The movie is such a passionless, undriven excuse for a movie. The story recaps the Dark Phoenix saga, obviously. But it somehow gets more wrong than The Last Stand did on the same exact story. Everyone on the cast just seems so dead inside. Like they'd all rather collectively be on any other set. The writing obliterates Professor X. Though this time, not literally, but it might as well have been. And it once again needlessly brings Magneto back into the action. I get that he's been here for every other movie before, but it made sense in the first X-Men movie, because he was the villain. It made sense in the second X-Men movie, because it was something that would affect all mutants, and it made sense in the third X-Men movie. Then you guys did the reboot. First Class, okay. Alright. Days of Future Past, I understand your need to bring him back for that. Yeah, sure. Anything past that is just unnecessary. And avoidable. You didn't have to do it. You chose to. This was a choice. And you did not have to do this. The movie also kills off Mystique, but her death somehow feels like it means even less than Scott's back in The Last Stand. And it's weird because including every actress who's been in this role, she has a whole lot more collective screen time than Cyclops. Personally, I think this was a really sad and sour note to end the main series on. And the fact that the New Mutants movie has been pushed back for the last 3 years, kinda not giving me a whole lot of faith in that project either. The X-Men movies really shit the bed. And as a franchise, the movies are really hit or miss. For me, it's a perfectly mixed bag. Because it is my personal belief that they did just as much bad as they did good. Yeah, the Wolverine was a tone-deaf snooze fest. But how good was Logan? Yeah, X-Men Origins ruined Deadpool. But man, those 2 Deadpool movies really revived and revitalized him. Sure, neither The Last Stand or Dark Phoenix could pull off the ultimate Jean Grey heel turn. But tell me Days of Future Past wasn't the perfect combination of old and new. For every flaw, there's an equally great strength. For everything they did wrong, there's something done just as right. So, you know, I guess they broke even. But you really have to hand it to everybody in the creative department for taking chances and also taking their material somewhat seriously, when anyone else who's put into that situation at that time wouldn't have. And for me, I think that's a big part of the reason they earned the longevity that they got. So with all that being said, thank you all for joining me here again, and I hope to see you in the next one.
I'm the clown prince of crime, and that was the prince of personality, the Infuso, or so he says. So if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole and you too want to become a V-tard, don't forget to like and subscribe. Follow the man on Twitter, because it's not stalking if it's on the internet after all. Join the fun by joining the Discord. If for some strange reason you want to show support, and I don't know why you would, and if you have $1 to spare, head over to the SIJW's Patreon, where you can request videos, get exclusive content, and early access to scheduled videos. Or head to his PayPal, where you can buy the shirts. Oh, aren't those lovely? And just remember, if you're not tuning in, you're missing out. Yeah.